Well, I want to talk to you about a growing trend that I see on the Outdoor Channel, Sportsman Channel, and just around the online community of whitetail hunting in general. And that's hunting on a food plot. How many of you do it? Have you found a lot of success doing it? And what's interesting, and I'll bring up the first point here, I want to point out first, before this first point, that I found a lot of success hunting off food plots. And in fact, the general, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but in general, a lot of my success has been off a food plot. Now, I've had food plots since 1995. I encourage people to plant them. I have a food plot book, but hunting on a food plot is not often the best. And this point number one right here, TV can be misleading about just about anything. Imagine how misleading it is when it comes to hunting on a food plot, and especially bow hunting. TV is very misleading because you'll watch some of the TV quote stars that are hunting on a food plot, and you don't know that they've only sat on that food plot 1 or 2 times for the entire season. They have hundreds of those setups that they can just walk into, if not dozens. And so they're walking into a very unpressured herd in a very large property that has been managed to the 1% of 1% of 1% because of the location. Not even necessarily how it's been managed, but it's been managed to a point where hunting pressure has been controlled, and you can walk right into an unsuspecting herd in probably one of the fantasy land states we talk about, in Iowa or Kansas, Missouri, Kentucky. Not that they're all fantasy land states or they all have those conditions, but in a lot of cases when you're dealing with a fraction of the number of bow hunters or the fraction of the amount of hunting pressure, and then you're adding an incredible quality habitat and large deer herds, it's a lot different than the folks that are hunting in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, portions of Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, all the way across the board. And it's not to say that you hunt this way in these fantasy land states and then you hunt a different way over here. Folks, if you hunt the same way that you would in Michigan to find success in Iowa, you're going to be an incredible hunter in Iowa, because if you are that careful with your hunting pressure scent, then you're going to have a great time hunting in some of these fantasy land states, because that's why they are fantasy land states. If you have to deal with what you deal with in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and you take that hunting approach and that hunting skill that you've earned to be successful and apply that to another state, you will have great success. Now, the big difference lies, and we'll get going with this in a second, is the age of a buck. What I find, the age of a buck, doesn't matter if it's a 5-year-old in Iowa or a 5-year-old in Michigan. The 5-year-old in Michigan was just lucky, a lot luckier than that 5-year-old in Wisconsin or in Iowa, because in Iowa there's areas where a 5-year-old buck is normal. In Michigan, I've been to properties where they literally, before I went there, 7 years prior, they hadn't seen an antlered buck during the daylight for 7 years hunting bow and gun. Let that soak in. They hadn't seen an antlered buck in 7 years during the daylight. And that's the difference. With one area, a 5-year-old might be a common. The 5-year-olds are still hard to hunt. They're still an old animal. They're still mature. They still escape predation, other hunters for a long period of time. And they've developed an independent culture and a way of life that is still difficult to hunt no matter what state they're in. Hunting on a food plot with a blind. You walk right in, sit in your blind that's right in the middle of a food plot and shoot a big buck. I can't tell you how many clients I go to in the non-fantasy land states where this is just not the case. And even in those states where there's a lot of older bucks, it's still, you can always do better if you hide yourself, if you become a predator, if you're putting your blind off to the side, if you're hiding that blind, if you're blocking your downwind in some way, if your access is good, you can still have a better hunt. So just because you see it on TV, it's a growing trend. I remember, and I'm not going to mention names, but I remember some of these hunting companies that I loved watching 20 years ago. And I still have old VHS tapes. And in those cases, a lot of times they were doing it on their own, hunting out of a lot of tree stands. And you'll see the percentage of hunts now have shifted throughout the years to hunting out of box blinds as opposed to tree stands. And so that's the one thing that I don't like. I hunt out of box blinds, I like them, but there's a time and a place. Our rednecks are awesome. And we shot 2 really nice bucks out of them last year with a muzzleloader and with a rifle, Diane and I. But there's a time and a place, and even those were not on a food plot. In fact, the closest food plot edge was about 150 yards away, so we're hunting from a distance. So when it comes to bows and hunting on a food plot, TV can be extremely misleading. Now, number 2, morning stats and hunting in the morning. I've shot about 70–80% of my bucks in the morning hours, especially during that pre-rut, rut, post-rut period. It's an awesome time to shoot a mature buck when they're getting back to their bedding a little bit later because the rut's on. It could be that you have a long feeding transition, maybe some white oaks dropping in late September, early October, some red oaks too, acorns. And it's taken a while for that buck to get all the way back to his bedding area, so you have some time to slip in between and maybe shoot him in the early season. Some of those opening day hunts where you know that there's a buck probably bedding in a certain location. He's feeding down in some ag fields 3/4 of a mile away and you're slipping in between. You're not going through the ag food to spook him out. And I think that's one of the #1 problems. Is morning stats. I shoot a lot of bucks in the morning because I'm getting into a position safely based on the time of the year and the location, and then waiting for those deer to come back to me. Really, really highly defined hunt. And I'm always looking for, you know, I say it often, your favorite tree stand shouldn't be the last stand that you shot a big buck out of. It should be the next stand that you shoot a big buck out of. You shouldn't have any favorites. I'm always looking for that next greatest morning stand that I can take advantage of and go sit in, because my morning stats are high. And what does that mean? You're not hunting on a food plot in the morning. If you're hunting on a food plot in the morning, you're spooking a lot of deer. You have to spook deer that are on that food source in the morning. I know people that are sitting all day. They go in and spook those deer off. They don't see anything till maybe the last few minutes of daylight because they spooked them off in the morning. And what a waste of time for an all-day sit. #3, distance to food plot, or to food in general. Whatever type of major food sources in your area. It could be a giant clear cut out on public land. But what I find the best spots to hunt are typically, if you're on ag land, it's going to be 200 to 400 yards from that major food source where they're feeding all night on, and maybe even a little food plot as they're sneaking through, but you're hunting 200 to 400 yards away from that. That's where I find my highest degree of success, is in that window. Again, not right on the food. In a big clear-cut setting on public land, it might be that you're hunting a half mile away, 3/4 of a mile away from that clear-cut, because on public land, a lot of times deer have space, and bucks will really seek out that reclusive area that offers a lot of low risk to them. So think about that window of where you should be hunting as it relates to the food source. It's not that the food source isn't important. It sets the foundation of the daily movement. But the distance you hunt from that food source is going to be your ultimate guide towards success. And what I find, at least that's 200 to 400 yards in mixed ag, and that's going to be 3/4 of a mile, maybe even a mile away in big open public land areas where those deer are relating to a clear cut, and you're not necessarily hunting right on that food source. Again, going into that food source morning hours and sitting right on that food source, a lot of times you're spooking those deer out of the area. I think there is an opportunity to hunt on food sources in the evening. We'll discuss that in a second. But really be mindful of that distance, especially in the morning hours when it comes to where you should be hunting away from that food source. And again, 200 to 400 yards in a mixed ag setting in the morning, and then up to a mile on public land, but generally a half mile to 3/4 of a mile away. Great reason to stay off the food source in general is there's a huge amount of risk. When it comes to risk, if you spook the food out, you're spooking the entire movement out, which means you spook your land out. On parcels that are 500 to 800 acres or less, and I'm not saying those are small, but what I'm saying is when you spook deer, they run a 1/4 mile to a half mile. They're not just running 100 yards and then just slowing down and sticking to that location. They're running a 1/4 mile or more. And so if you have a 600 acre parcel, you're driving through the middle of your property, you spook deer off food plots, you could be pushing them to the outer edges of your property, which is why I go to a lot of those size parcels, and hunters are still sitting on the borders in the tree stand waiting for deer to come back after they push them off in the morning. You can imagine if every property owner is doing that, which is regular in a neighborhood, then you're lowering the buck age structure because you're pushing deer too often across property borders, which exposes them to more hunters, possibly even roads, or more predation rates, higher predation rates. You'd rather everything be calm and really relaxed on your land. And if you spook out those food plots, you're not only making those food plots nocturnal, but you're establishing a border of up to a 1/4 mile around that food source, depending on how big the food source and how much you spook it out, that mature bucks just don't want to live in. Sure, those does and fawns are the great deceivers, maybe even some young bucks, they'll move in and around that property. But once you spook the food out, you spook your land out. Live by that rule, and that'll keep you hunting off your food sources unless you can get in and out with absolutely spooking 0 deer when you do so to hunt. #5, one reason to hunt in that 200 to 400 yard window a lot, get off your food plots, is that you can enjoy the rut. There's also rut activity that takes place on food plots, but boy, there's rut activity that takes place all day out in the woods, in the cover somewhere. That's where bucks are chasing, seeking, pushing does, I find, to little hidden corners where they breed those does. They try to get them away from other deer. You're not getting away from those fawns and does. You're not getting them away from other deer when you're pushing them onto a food plot. Those mature bucks know that. And it's not to say they don't come out, especially in the afternoon, evening hours, looking for does during that middle of the rut. But boy, a lot of times if you stick a long ways off that food plot and you're in that 200 to 400 yard window, that's when I shoot a lot of my bucks. They're actively participating in rutting activity. Maybe they're moving between bedding areas. Maybe they're coming back from a long distance food source a couple hours late that they otherwise would get to a bedding area, just because they're spending a lot of times making rubs and scrapes on those field edges. But I'm seeing grunting, chasing, fighting. A lot of that takes place back in the cover somewhere. And I'll say number 6, evening hunting in general on a food plot. As much as I can tell you to get away from those food plots in the morning, I'd like to see you relate especially to those food plots in the evening. That doesn't mean you sit on those food plots. If you're going to sit on those food plots and you have a chance of spooking deer getting in and out, you cannot hunt the food plot. Your success is going to dwindle drastically. I like hunting at least 50 to 100 yards, maybe even 150 yards away from that food plot on defined travel corridors that are going to the food plot. Add a water hole in the dry area, add a mock scrape. You can define that movement so deer are actually coming to that point right in front of your tree stand for a bow shot and then heading to that food plot. If you're hunting the evening food plot, we love sitting in our rednecks at 100 yards away, 150, 200 yards. We can sneak in from the backside. We have a lot of fun doing so. We even had Dylan, Dante, Diane, and I in a blind this year, and we had a lot of fun. The 4 of us were sitting in there, and there's times we've had 3 of us in there. But we can sneak into those blinds because of how they're positioned. But they're positioned so we don't spook out the food plot. Because regardless of whether you're hunting in the evening near a food plot, you choose to hunt on a small hunting plot on the way to a big destination field and that's a pass-through, which is a bad idea. Regardless of whether you're hunting up in that morning stand somewhere 200 to 400 yards away, 500 yards away from a food source, whatever it might be, the main goal of your hunting on your land in general is to not spook the deer. So if you're using your food plots too often, you not only destroy the evening opportunities, you destroy the daylight movement on that food plot, but you destroy those exceptional morning opportunities that are 200 to 400 yards away. Because guess what? If you don't have the food, you don't have those does bedded nearby. If you turn that food source into a nocturnal area, there's going to be a ripple effect around that food plot, and deer don't want to enter that area. And those mature bucks that you would have otherwise had at 200 to 400 yards away from that food plot, even during the rut, just are not going to be there. They're not likely to be there at all during the daylight. And if they are there, it's going to be to a very small percentage and a fraction of what they would have otherwise been. Food plots are outstanding. They set the entire foundation of daily movement for the deer herd, but they come at a high risk as much as reward. Because if you spook the deer herd when they're coming to that food source, you just educated every deer in the woods. And don't fall into the trap that on TV it looks really cool to go sit in the box blind on the edge or middle of that food source and shoot a big buck, because folks, that isn't reality for 99.999% of all hunters out there. And I hope that you will look at not only the power of food plots going into this season to really mold and shape and set the foundation movement on your land, but the power of those same food plots to destroy your hunt if you hunt carelessly and you don't learn to manage that power of attraction with your food plot program this fall.